countries are still spending millions on tanks, given the fact that it would appear that $500 drones are destroying them. The drone-infested battle base, the thousands of drones, it's been very difficult for tanks to operate. Now, the Russian tanks, the T-72s, T-80s and T-90s, are fairly poorly protected and very easily blow up if an FPV drone drops a hand grenade into it. Well, the history of tank warfare is very long. It goes back 110 years to the Battle of Cambrai in the First World War. And after the end of the First World War, everybody predicted the end of the tank. But my new book, Tank Command, really its epitaph is "The tank is dead, long live the tank," really tries to articulate why countries are still spending millions on tanks, given the fact that it would appear that $500 drones are destroying them. I think if we look right back to the start, the biggest concern that the British tank crews had at the Battle of Cambrai in 1917 were German soldiers throwing what's called sticky bombs, hand grenades, on top of tanks where they're weakest. And to overcome this, they put chicken wire cages on the top. We then wind forward to really not quite today, but a few years ago, when FPV drones were dropping hand grenades through tanks and destroying them. And to counter that, the Ukrainian tank crews put iron cages on top to stop them. So really, the tank has evolved. The key element, the key principle of a tank and the capability it has is firepower, protection and mobility to create what we call shock action. And the tank is still the one thing on the battlefield that can maneuver at speed. Now, the fact that we've gone into trench warfare in Ukraine and it's all very static is because tanks have become static. Because of the drone-infested battle base, the thousands of drones, it's been very difficult for tanks to operate. However, it's important to look at exactly what the tanks are. Now, the Russian tanks, the T-72s, T-80s and T-90s, are fairly poorly protected and very easily blow up if an FPV drone drops a hand grenade into it. Conversely, Western tanks like the Challenger 2 that I spent most of my career on have armoured charge bins, as we call them. So if a drone drops a hand grenade into a Challenger 2, it might injure the crew, but it won't blow up because it won't blow up the charges in there. So that is why we see a lot of Russian tanks destroyed, over 6,000 in the Ukraine war so far, but very few Western tanks. And the two British Challenger 2s that were hit were repaired and are now back on the front line. So the key thing is to allow the tank to manoeuvre again. Now, what is happening, and the Ukraine brilliance in tank warfare, is they are now starting to manoeuvre with tanks and other armoured vehicles because they can suppress the drone threat. And I test drove the Challenger 3, the latest British tank that is coming in next year. And what these latest tanks have is what we call active protection defensive aid suites. In other words, what they can do is they can detect drones at sort of 3 or 4 kilometers. And then they have turrets on their turrets, small turrets, that fire multiple shots so they can take down multiple drones at a time and then still maneuver, protected against direct fire other tanks by their armour. And because they're moving at speed, can then create shock action and take back land again. So the reason that the tanks have endured over the last 110 years is each time there has been a threat, and we had bazookas in the Second World War. We developed better armour to protect against them. Then in the 70s and 80s, in the Arab-Israeli wars, where they had anti-tank guided weapons with high explosive heads to them, we then developed what we call reactive armour, which meant that the tanks survived any attack. And then moving forward into Ukraine, it's about protecting tanks against drones. Now, we've seen some incredible tanks the Russians have produced, the Turtle tank and the Dandelion tank, with masses of armour on top of it. But actually, it seems the way that the tank will evolve is by electronically being able to suppress the drone threat, but also with these active defensive aid suites to be able to shoot them down in multiple times. Now, it is like any threat, it is a development. And what you have to do is, as a new threat arrives, you have to try and make sure that you can counter it and move forward. And the tank has done that for the last 110 years. So, I mean, I think the final paragraph in my book is that I am sure that in 100 years' time, somebody like me will be talking about something called the tank doing shock action because it has mobility, protection, and firepower. That's why I espouse that there is still a role for the tank, and that is why I think a lot of nations like the Polish and others are spending millions on new tank fleets, but they've got to make sure that they can survive on the battlefield. That is the challenge. What I'm predicting and what I write about is a number of things. I think tanks will become more autonomous. So you might have one manned main battle tank like a Challenger 3, and then you'll have 3 or 4 autonomous unmanned tanks, which in effect are just big guns on a tracked vehicle. And we're seeing in Ukraine lots of autonomous vehicles. We're seeing autonomous ambulances going to rescue people. And of course, the great thing about an autonomous vehicle, you don't have a crew in it, so it's less dangerous. But it's also much easier to train on. It took me a year to train as a young tank commander to fight a Challenger 1 tank in those days. The trouble the Russians are having, they can't train their new crews quick enough. But of course, if you've got an autonomous tank, you just load the software. There's very little training involved. So I think we'll see it more autonomous. And when it comes to drones, what is developing now is that tanks have their own drones. So they have drones at the target end, if you like, where they're trying to hit people, which is identifying targets and also correcting shot. And they have their own drones that are protecting them. So as drones are so ubiquitous and so cheap, they're being used for a whole host of things. But I think ultimately we will see less manned vehicles, less manned tanks, and more autonomous, and for a whole host of reasons. So the other element with the tank, I'm sure we'll see more use of electronics, electronic drive tanks. I mean, even the Second World War, Porsche, who made a lot of the German tanks, were trying to use electronic drives, which is remarkable. And I think we'll also see what we call rail guns, electronic guns, where you can fire a projectile at a much, much higher speed than you can using conventional explosives. So autonomous is going to be the way forward, and that's what we're seeing in Ukraine. The massive use of drones, less soldiers on the front line. Conversely, of course, the Russians are still, it's all about manpower. They've got 600,000 soldiers on the front line. They've lost over 1.5 million, and they're losing 1,000 a day, which is about 10 times what Ukraine's using, because they cannot, they haven't got the technology and the capability to develop drones in the same way Ukraine has. They seem to be spending all their time and money on developing, hypersonic missiles like the Roshenko missile that cost millions and millions of pounds and don't seem to work anyway. So, yeah, I think that's the way we're going.